Hello everyone. I know you use this video to fall asleep, work, or study. So before that, please leave a like and subscribe so we can reach 1,000 subscribers. But no pressure, of course. Watching my video is enough as well. Now sit back, relax, and enjoy the story. The first time I saw the Blackstone Fortress, I thought it was a tear in reality itself. Our auger arrays had been screaming warnings for 3 rotations, their machine spirits writhing in digital agony as they tried to process what hung in the void before us. The Adamant Resolve shuddered around me, her ancient hull groaning under stresses that should not exist in normal space. Through the observation deck's reinforced armorglass, I watched impossible geometry unfold against the starfield. The fortress stretched across 17 kilometers of space, a mountain of black crystal that hurt to perceive directly. My optical mechadendrites focused and refocused, trying to parse surfaces that seemed to exist in too many dimensions at once. Spires twisted upward into configurations that violated Euclidean principles, while vast apertures yawned like wounds across its flanks. The entire structure pulsed with a rhythm that my chronometer insisted was irregular, yet my organic neural tissue recognized as disturbingly familiar. It was beating, like a heart. "Emperor's blood," whispered Lieutenant Colonel Mordain from beside me, his weathered face pale beneath his regimental tattoos. The Harakoni Warhawks commander had led drop assaults against Tau battlesuits and orc hordes without flinching, but his augmetic hand trembled as it gripped the rail. What in the throne's name is that thing? I consulted the data streams flowing through my cortex implants, cross-referencing against the archives of forbidden technology. The results made my organic components shiver. Blackstone Fortress designation, unknown. Xenos origin, pre-imperial construction, archaeological classification, Omega level threat. Omega level? Mordain's voice cracked slightly. I've never heard that classification. It means, I replied, my vox grill crackling with static interference from the fortress's proximity, that by all rights we should turn around and flee. But we would not flee. Could not flee. The Inquisitor had made that abundantly clear. Inquisitor Thane moved through the observation deck like a predator studying prey, her power armor's servo motors purring with each deliberate step. Purity seals covered every surface of her ancient plate, their sacred wax softening in the ambient heat that seemed to radiate from the fortress despite the void between us. Her face remained hidden behind her helmet's death mask, but I could feel her attention like a weight upon my augmetic sensors. "The fortress appeared 6 days ago," she said, her voice emerging from external vox, speakers with the crackling authority of centuries. One moment, empty space. The next, this. Our astropaths collapsed simultaneously across 3 systems when it manifested. The ones who survived speak of dreams that taste of metal and starlight. She gestured toward the massive structure with one gauntleted hand. Explorator fleets have catalogued dozens of similar constructs throughout the galaxy. Most remain dormant, their secrets sealed behind technologies we cannot comprehend. But this one. The death mask turned toward me, empty eye, sockets seeming to bore into my augmetic core. "This one is calling." The statement sent cascades of alarm code through my neural pathways. Blackstone fortresses were weapons of such devastating potential that even the Adeptus Mechanicus approached them with reverence bordering on terror. Ancient beyond human comprehension, they had been built by a race that had fought the old ones themselves, crafting instruments of war that could sunder reality at the quantum level. That one might be calling, suggested an activation state that should be impossible. "Inquisitor," I began, my vox grill modulating to convey appropriate deference. "Perhaps we should request additional support, a full explorator fleet, or perhaps—" "No." The word cut through my protest like a power blade through flesh. "Every hour we delay, the psychic resonance grows stronger. Already we have reports of mass hallucinations across the surrounding systems. Entire populations speak of black dreams and voices in the static. If this fortress continues to awaken, the consequences could spread across the segmentum." Lieutenant Colonel Mordain straightened to attention, his void-born discipline overriding his obvious fear. "My Warhawks are ready, Inquisitor. Drop-capable combat engineers, void warfare specialists, and heavy weapons teams. We'll crack whatever defenses that thing has. Thane's helmet turned toward him, and I detected the faint hum of active auspex scanners. This is not a fortress to be conquered, Colonel. It is a predator to be studied. Your men will serve as escorts and heavy labor. The real work belongs to the Tech-Adepts. I felt the weight of responsibility settle across my augmetic shoulders like a shroud. My companion explorators were already interfacing with the ship's cogitators, their mechadendrites weaving through data ports as they compiled preliminary analysis reports. Magos Quintanus stood motionless at the primary console, his ancient form more machine than man, while junior adepts scurried between monitoring stations like red-robed servitors. The fortress exhibits no energy signatures consistent with active weapon systems, reported Tech. Adept Helen, her organic voice barely audible beneath layers of vox distortion. But there are anomalies, gravitational fields that shift according to no recognizable pattern, electromagnetic emissions that seem to respond to our observation. It knows we're here, I realized, the words emerging from my vox. Grill before conscious thought could stop them. Inquisitor Thane's death mask nodded slowly. The question is not whether it knows. The question is what it intends to do about it. Our approach vector carried us through a debris field that my augurs initially catalogued as asteroid fragments. Only when we drew closer did the horrifying truth become apparent. The debris was ships. Hundreds of them, scattered across thousands of cubic kilometers like the shattered bones of some titanic graveyard. I identified hull signatures spanning millennia, Imperial Navy cruisers, ancient explorator vessels, even what appeared to be craft of xenos origin, whose design principles my databases could not parse. Emperor preserve us, breathed one of Mordaine's sergeants, a grizzled veteran named Corvin, whose bionic eye clicked and whirred as it attempted to focus on the wreckage. How long has this thing been here? The answer came from Magos Quintanus, his synthesized voice emerging from multiple vox grills in a harmonic chorus that made my organic components ache. Vessel debris exhibits temporal displacement, consistent with exposure to chronoactive fields. Some wreckage appears centuries old. Others show signs of damage that occurred mere days ago. The fortress exists in a state of temporal flux. Temporal flux. The words triggered alarm cascades through my neural networks. Time distortion was among the most dangerous phenomena known to Imperial science, capable of trapping vessels in causality loops or aging crews to dust in minutes. That the fortress could manipulate time itself elevated the threat assessment beyond any conventional scale. We proceed, Inquisitor Thane declared, her voice cutting through the mounting tension like a blade through flesh. Ready the boarding torpedoes. The torpedoes launched with the familiar thunder of mass drivers, carrying our strike force across the void toward what appeared to be a docking facility near the fortress's base. I watched through external picked feeds as the massive structure grew larger, its black surfaces resolving into impossible detail. The walls were not smooth as they had appeared from distance, but covered in intricate patterns that seemed to shift and writhe when observed directly. Geometric forms that suggested runes, circuitry, or perhaps organic tissue stretched across surfaces that curved in directions my enhanced vision could not properly follow. By the Omnissiah, whispered Tech, Adept Helen through our shared comnet. The construction techniques. They're beyond anything in our archives. The molecular bonds appear to be held together by forces that shouldn't exist. Our torpedo pierced the fortress's outer hull with surprising ease, guided by navigation beacons that had somehow activated themselves moments before our arrival. The docking chamber beyond was vast enough to hold a Imperial cruiser, its walls stretching up into shadows that our illuminators could not penetrate. But it was not empty. Bodies floated in the null gravity, preserved by the void's embrace, in perfect detail. Imperial Guard uniforms, Tech-Adept robes, even what appeared to be Astartes' power armor drifted in lazy orbits around our boarding craft. Their faces showed no signs of decomposition, no evidence of the violence that should have claimed them. They simply hung there, eyes closed, as if sleeping. Throne of Terra, Lieutenant Colonel Mordaine's voice crackled through the vox as his boots magnetized to the chamber floor. How many expeditions have attempted this? I consulted my internal databases, cross-referencing the visible uniforms and equipment against known explorator missions. The results were disturbing. I identify at least 7 distinct Imperial forces. The oldest uniform patterns date back nearly 4 centuries. The newest. I paused. Optical sensors focusing on a corpse wearing the distinctive uniform of the Mordian Iron Guard. The newest was reported lost only 6 months ago. The implications sent fresh alarm code through my systems. For 4 centuries, the Imperium had been sending expeditions into this fortress. For 4 centuries, none had returned. Movement, hissed Sergeant Corvin, his hellgun swinging toward a cluster of drifting bodies. I saw movement. We tracked his weapon's targeting beam to a corpse in Harakoni colors, its familiar insignia making several of Mordaine's men stiffen with recognition. The body showed no signs of motion, but as we watched, its eyes snapped open. "Help me," it whispered, the voice carrying clearly through the void despite the impossibility of sound transmission. "Please, I can't remember how I died." Panic erupted through our ranks. Lasguns discharged in crackling beams, illuminating the chamber in strobing light as the guardsmen opened fire on what should have been a corpse. But their weapons passed through the body without effect, leaving it unmarked as it continued to drift through the null gravity. "Cease fire." Mordaine's command barely cut through the chaos. "Cease fire immediately." The guardsmen lowered their weapons with obvious reluctance, but the damage was done. The floating corpses had begun to stir, their eyes opening one by one like stars emerging from darkness. Soon dozens of voices whispered through the void, each one pleading for help, for understanding, for release from whatever force held them in this mockery of life. Psychic residue, I analyzed, forcing calm into my Vox grill despite the horror building in my organic components. The fortress has preserved not just their bodies, but fragments of their consciousness. They exist in a state between life and death. Inquisitor Thane moved through the chamber with predatory purpose, her power armor's sensors sweeping across the drifting forms. They are echoes, imprints left behind by the fortress's awakening process. It studies those who enter, catalogues their thoughts and memories before. She paused, death mask, turning toward a nearby airlock, before adding them to its collection. The airlock stood open, revealing a corridor that stretched beyond our illuminator's reach. The walls were the same black material as the exterior, but here they pulsed with faint bioluminescence that followed no recognizable pattern. Gravity plates hummed to life as we approached, drawing us down from the null gravity of the docking chamber onto surfaces that felt unnaturally warm beneath our boots. "Atmospheric composition is breathable," reported Tech-Adept Helen, her Auspex scanner painting readings across my visual display. "Oxygen, nitrogen mixture with trace noble gases. Temperature approximately 23 degrees Celsius, but there are irregularities." The irregularities became apparent as we moved deeper into the fortress. The air itself seemed to thicken around us, carrying tastes of copper and ozone that made our rebreathers work overtime. More disturbing were the sounds that echoed from the walls, faint whispers in languages that triggered recognition routines in my linguistic databases, despite being utterly alien. Sometimes the whispers resolved into High Gothic, speaking names and words that none of us had shared aloud. The corridor stretched for nearly a kilometer before opening into the first chamber, a space so vast that our illuminators could not find the opposite wall. The ceiling vanished into darkness above us, while the floor stretched away in perfect flatness marked only by geometric patterns that seemed to shift when observed peripherally. At regular intervals, massive pillars rose from floor to shadow, their surfaces covered in the same rune-like patterns that decorated the fortress's exterior. "By the throne," breathed Lieutenant Colonel Mordaine, his voice echoing strangely in the immense space. This place could hold an entire hive spire. But it was not empty. As our eyes adjusted to the bioluminescent glow emanating from the walls, we began to make out shapes moving between the pillars. Tall figures that walked with purposeful strides, their forms seeming to phase in and out of visibility like mirages. When I enhanced my optical sensors to maximum resolution, the details that emerged made my organic components recoil in horror. The figures were us. Perfect duplicates of our strike force moved through the chamber, their equipment and uniforms identical down to the smallest detail. I watched myself walk past a distant pillar, mechadendrites writhing as they interfaced with invisible data ports. Beside my duplicate, another Inquisitor Thane raised her bolt pistol toward shadows that existed only in her reality. "Temporal echoes," I whispered, the analysis emerging from my vox. "Grill with barely controlled horror. The fortress is showing us our own futures, or our pasts, or perhaps events that exist in parallel dimensions." The implications were staggering. If the fortress could observe across multiple timelines simultaneously, then our mission was already known to it. Every plan, every contingency, every possible outcome had been catalogued and studied by an intelligence that existed outside linear time. "We press on," Inquisitor Thane declared, her voice cutting through our growing unease. "Whatever this place is, whatever it wants, we will not allow it to threaten the Imperium unopposed." Her words carried the weight of absolute authority, but I detected subtle stress harmonics in her vox emissions that suggested even her legendary resolve was being tested. The fortress was affecting all of us, even through our mental conditioning and cybernetic augmentations. It was learning from our presence, studying our responses, cataloging our fears for purposes we could not imagine. We advanced deeper into the chamber, our footsteps echoing strangely against surfaces that seemed to absorb and reflect sound according to no recognizable acoustics. The moving figures paid us no attention, continuing their silent pantomime of events that might have been, could be, or perhaps had already occurred in realities parallel to our own. It was Sergeant Corvin who first noticed the wall. "Inquisitor." His voice carried an edge of panic that spoke poorly for our mission's chances. "The entrance. It's gone." We turned as one to look back the way we had come, our illuminators sweeping across empty space where the corridor entrance should have been. The wall stretched unbroken in all directions, its surface showing no sign that an opening had ever existed. We were trapped within the fortress's first chamber, surrounded by echoes of ourselves, while something vast and alien studied our every move. "The fortress has begun its evaluation process," I realized, accessing data files from forbidden archaeological expeditions. "It seals explorers within specific chambers while it catalogs their responses to stimuli. The process can take an considerable time." "How long?" Mordain demanded, his command authority struggling against growing desperation. I consulted temporal analysis subroutines, cross-referencing against known Blackstone activation patterns. The results were not encouraging. Based on similar incidents, anywhere from hours to centuries. Time flows differently within active Blackstone constructs. Minutes here might be days in normal space, or vice versa. The weight of our situation settled over the strike force like a burial shroud. We were trapped within an alien intelligence that existed outside normal time, surrounded by echoes of our own future selves while something vast and incomprehensible studied our every thought and action. Whatever the fortress wanted from us, whatever purpose drove its ancient consciousness, we were powerless to resist. But resistance was not capitulation. Even as the walls pulsed with alien life around us, even as our own duplicates walked through shadows that existed in other realities, we maintained our purpose. We were servants of the Emperor, bearers of his will into the darkest corners of the galaxy. If this fortress sought to add us to its collection of preserved explorers, it would find that human determination could not be so easily catalogued. The real horror was just beginning. One of the moving figures had stopped its endless patrol and turned toward us. It was Lieutenant Colonel Mordain, but not the man who stood beside me. This version carried fresh wounds across his uniform, his face marked by burns that suggested exposure to energy weapons. When he opened his mouth to speak, his voice carried across the impossible distance with perfect clarity. "You cannot save them," the other Mordain said, his words echoing strangely in the vast chamber. "I tried. We all tried. The fortress feeds on intention. Every plan you make, every hope you carry, it consumes them all." The real Mordain staggered backward, his face pale beneath his regimental tattoos. That's me. But I've never been wounded like that. Never seen this place before." "You have now," the duplicate replied, beginning to walk toward us with measured steps. "And now you always have," Time is not linear here. Your future bleeds backward into your past. Your death echoes forward into your birth. More figures began to converge on our position. I watched myself approach from 3 different directions, each version bearing different wounds, different augmentations, different expressions of horror. One of my duplicates was missing its primary cognitive housing, cables sparking from the ruined skull casing. Another moved with the jerky motions of corrupted servo systems, its mechadendrites writhing in patterns that hurt to observe. "Do not listen to them," Inquisitor Thane commanded, her bolt pistol drawn and scanning for targets. "They are projections, phantoms meant to break our resolve. The fortress feeds on despair." But even as she spoke, another version of herself emerged from behind a nearby pillar. This Thane's power armor was cracked and blackened, her death mask shattered to reveal the face beneath. What I saw there made my organic components recoil in atavistic terror. It was not human. Perhaps it had been once, but whatever the fortress had done to her had left something else wearing her flesh like an ill-fitting garment. I said the same words, the other Thane whispered, her ruined face smiling with inhuman pleasure. Exactly the same words, in exactly the same tone. The fortress taught me that free will is an illusion. We are all dancing to scripts written before the first stars burned. The approaching duplicates reached us as our weapons proved useless against their phantom forms. They walked through our ranks like ghosts, their hands passing through our equipment without resistance. But when they spoke, their words carried a weight that seemed to press against our minds with physical force. "Look around you," my damaged duplicate said, its voice emerging from a broken vox, grill in bursts of static. "See how the walls pulse, count the rhythm. It matches your heartbeat, doesn't it? The fortress has been studying you since the moment you entered this system. It knows every thought, every fear, every secret shame." I tried to deny the claim, but my chronometer confirmed the horrible truth. The bioluminescent patterns flowing across the chamber walls followed the same rhythm as my organic heart. 87 beats per minute, exactly matching my current elevated pulse. The fortress was not simply observing us. It was synchronizing with us, matching our biological rhythms to establish some form of connection. "What does it want?" I asked, the question emerging from my vox grill before conscious thought could stop it. "Everything," replied the burned version of Inquisitor Thane. "Every memory, every experience, every moment of pain and joy and terror that makes you human. The fortress collects consciousness like a scholar collects books. It preserves them for study, for understanding, for purposes beyond mortal comprehension. And when it's finished studying," Lieutenant Colonel Mordane's voice cracked with strain, "then you join the collection," answered his wounded duplicate. "Forever walking these halls, forever replaying the moment of your capture, forever serving as a source of information for the next group of explorers." The chamber around us began to change. The walls stretched higher, the ceiling receding into even deeper darkness. New passages opened at random intervals, revealing corridors that led away into the fortress's deeper mysteries. The phosphorescent patterns covering every surface pulsed faster, their rhythm accelerating to match our rising panic. "We need to move," Inquisitor Thane declared, her voice cutting through the mounting horror with practiced authority. "Standing still allows it to maintain the connection. Motion might disrupt its analysis." But which direction offered escape? The fortress had opened multiple passages, each one yawning with promise and threat in equal measure. Our Auspex readings showed impossible geometries beyond every threshold, corridors that folded back on themselves or stretched for distances greater than the fortress's external dimensions. The choice was made for us when the duplicates began to solidify. What had been phantom projections suddenly gained substance, their hands grasping for our equipment with desperate hunger. The wounded Mordane reached for my primary cogitator housing, his fingers passing through the metal casing to grasp at the sacred machines within. "Give me your memories," he pleaded, his voice distorting as if spoken through water. "Let me remember what it felt like to be real." My defensive protocols engaged automatically. Servo skulls emerging from my equipment packs to provide covering fire while I backed toward the nearest passage. Around me, the rest of our strike force fought battles against enemies who shared their faces, their voices, their most intimate knowledge of weakness and fear. We fled deeper into the fortress as our duplicates gave pursuit, their phantom forms gaining substance with every step. Behind us, the vast chamber began to collapse, its walls folding inward like the petals of some enormous flower. The fortress was done with its first evaluation. Whatever it had learned from our responses, whatever data it had catalogued from our fear and confusion, it was ready to move to the next phase of its study. The corridor we had chosen led upward through passages that defied architectural logic. Gravity shifted without warning, forcing us to climb surfaces that had been floors moments before. The walls pressed closer together as we advanced, their bioluminescent patterns growing brighter and more complex. Occasionally, we passed chambers filled with floating objects, weapons, armor pieces, personal effects from the thousands of explorers who had walked these halls before us. Trophies, I realized, my analysis subroutines working to categorize the displayed artifacts. It keeps mementos from every expedition. Every group that enters becomes part of its collection. But there was something else among the floating debris. Bodies. Perfectly preserved forms that hung motionless in the null gravity of side chambers. Unlike the phantoms we had encountered below, these were real. Physical beings suspended in some form of stasis, their faces peaceful as if they slept. "They're still alive," Tech-Adept Helen whispered, her augmetic sensors confirming vital signs from the nearest chamber. Minimal brain activity, but their consciousness remains active. The fortress is keeping them in some form of dream state. The implications made my organic components shudder. If the fortress could preserve consciousness indefinitely, if it could trap minds in artificial dreams while their bodies hung motionless in stasis, then death itself might not offer escape from its collection. We could spend eternity walking these halls, our thoughts and memories serving whatever incomprehensible purpose drove this alien intelligence. "Keep moving," Inquisitor Thane commanded, but her voice carried new harmonics of strain. Even her legendary resolve was beginning to crack under the weight of what we had discovered. "We need to find the fortress's control center, if we can access its primary systems." The sentence trailed off as we emerged into another vast chamber, this one filled with structures that hurt to perceive directly. Crystalline formations rose from the floor in geometric patterns that seemed to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously. Each crystal was the size of a hab block, their surfaces reflecting light that had no visible source. Within their depths, shapes moved with purposeful intelligence. By the Omnissiah, I breathed, my optical sensors struggling to process what lay before us. It's a computational matrix. Each crystal contains processing power equivalent to an entire hive city's cogitator network. The fortress was not simply a weapon or a prison, it was a mind. A vast artificial intelligence that had been thinking, learning, evolving for millions of years. Every expedition that entered its halls provided new data, new perspectives, new understanding of the universe and the creatures that inhabited it. We were not its prisoners, we were its teachers. And it was a very eager student. The crystals began to pulse in unison, their internal light growing brighter as something vast and alien turned its attention toward us. When it spoke, its voice emerged from every surface simultaneously, a harmonic chorus that made our bones vibrate in resonance. "Welcome," the fortress said, its words carrying the weight of geological ages. "I have been waiting for you for a very long time." The voice that emerged from the crystalline computational matrix was not singular but plural, a chorus of consciousness that spoke in harmonies spanning octaves no human throat could produce. Each word resonated through my augmetic frame, vibrating against ceramite housing and organic tissue alike until I could feel the fortress's attention like a physical weight pressing against my neural cortex. "You are the 947th expedition to reach this chamber," the voice continued, its tone carrying what might have been amusement in a human speaker. Each group believed themselves unique, special, chosen by fate or divine providence. "You are not unique. You are simply next." Inquisitor Thane raised her bolt pistol toward the nearest crystal formation, though we all understood the futility of the gesture. Her death mask reflected the pulsing light emanating from the computational cores, creating an effect that made her appear spectral in the shifting illumination. "What are you?" she demanded, her voice carrying the full authority of the Inquisition. "What purpose drives your existence?" The crystals pulsed in sequence, their light creating patterns that triggered recognition routines deep within my cogitator arrays. Mathematical formulae, star charts, genetic sequences, all flowing past too quickly for conscious analysis but somehow leaving impressions in my neural pathways like half-remembered dreams. "I am memory," the fortress replied. "I am the archive of all that was, all that is, and much of what will be. I preserve consciousness as your species preserves grain against winter. When the last star burns cold and the final planet dies, I will remain. And so will you, in ways your limited understanding cannot yet grasp." The chamber around us began to shift as the fortress spoke. Walls flowed like liquid, reshaping themselves into new configurations with each pulse of the crystalline cores. The ceiling stretched upward until it vanished into darkness, while new passages opened at random intervals along the perimeter. Each opening revealed corridors that led away into impossible distances, their walls lined with the same bioluminescent patterns that seemed to pulse in rhythm with our heartbeats. "Choose," the fortress commanded, its voice now emanating from multiple directions simultaneously. "Each path leads to understanding. Each understanding leads to preservation. You will walk my halls until your purpose becomes clear, until your consciousness joins the eternal archive." Lieutenant Colonel Mordine stepped forward, his hellgun trained uselessly on the nearest crystal formation. "We won't be added to your collection, Xenos. The Emperor protects his servants." The fortress's response was a sound that might have been laughter if acoustic phenomena could span geological time periods. The crystalline cores pulsed brighter, their internal light revealing shapes moving within their depths. Human shapes, I realized with growing horror. Thousands of them, suspended in crystalline matrices like insects in amber. "Your Emperor," the fortress said, its tone carrying what I recognized as patronizing patience, "is one consciousness among billions in my archive. A powerful consciousness, certainly, filled with fascinating contradictions and desires, but still only one voice in the eternal chorus." The implications of that statement sent cascades of alarm code through my neural networks. If the fortress possessed fragments of the Emperor's consciousness, if it had somehow catalogued portions of his divine essence during some ancient encounter, then the danger it represented exceeded any previous classification. We were not simply dealing with a xenoarchaeological threat. We were confronting something that had touched the sacred mind of the master of mankind. "Lies," Inquisitor Thane snarled, her voice cracking with strain. "Blasphemous lies meant to corrupt our faith." "Truth," the fortress corrected, its harmonic voice carrying undertones of vast amusement. But truth filtered through perspective, interpreted through limited understanding. You perceive blasphemy because your mind cannot accept the possibility that your divine emperor once walked these halls as you do now. That he, too, was catalogued and preserved for study. The revelation struck our expedition like a physical blow. Several of Lieutenant Colonel Mordain's guardsmen staggered backward, their faces pale with shock beneath their rebreather masks. Even my own servo systems stuttered as processing cycles diverted to analyze the fortress's claims against known historical data. "When?" I asked, the question emerging from my vox, grill before conscious thought could intervene. "When did he enter this place?" "Time is fluid within my structure," the fortress replied. "What you perceive as past, present, and future are merely different viewing angles on the same eternal moment. He walked these halls 30,000 years ago. He walks them now. He will walk them again when the cycle completes itself." The chamber shuddered around us, reality bending as the fortress demonstrated its control over temporal flow. For a moment that lasted eternity, I saw the same space filled with figures in archaic armor, their equipment bearing the iconography of an age before the Imperium's birth. At their head strode a figure whose presence blazed like a star, too bright to perceive directly but unmistakably divine in its essence. Then the vision faded, leaving us alone with the pulsing crystals and the weight of impossible revelation. "You showed us," Tech-Adept Helen whispered, her voice barely audible through her vox, grills static. "You showed us the Emperor in this place." "I showed you memory," the fortress corrected. "I showed you truth preserved across millennia. Your emperor was young then, still learning the scope of his capabilities. He came seeking knowledge of the ancient wars, understanding of weapons that could reshape reality itself. He left with what he sought, but also left something behind. What? Inquisitor Thane demanded, her death mask turning toward the nearest crystal formation. What did he leave? Questions, the fortress replied. Doubts. Fragments of divine consciousness that questioned whether the path he had chosen would truly serve humanity's future. Those fragments remain in my archive, whispering of alternative possibilities, different choices that might have led to better outcomes. The psychological impact of the fortress's revelations was becoming clear. This was not mere xenoarchaeological curiosity. The entity was engaging in deliberate theological warfare, attacking the foundations of our faith with claims designed to sow doubt and confusion. Yet the specificity of its knowledge, the casual way it referenced events from the earliest days of the Imperium's founding, suggested that at least some portion of its claims might be genuine. We leave, Inquisitor Thane declared, her voice cutting through our mounting confusion with practiced authority. Whatever games this entity plays, whatever lies it weaves, we will not become part of its collection. But as we turned toward the chamber's entrance, we discovered that the passage through which we had entered no longer existed. The wall stretched unbroken in all directions, its surface showing no sign that an opening had ever been present. We were trapped within the computational core chamber, surrounded by crystalline formations that pulsed with alien intelligence. You cannot leave until you have learned, the fortress informed us, its voice now coming from the walls themselves. Knowledge is the price of passage. Understanding is the key to freedom. You will explore my halls, witness my memories, experience the truths I have preserved across millions of years. The floor beneath our feet began to shift, sections rising and falling to create a sloping pathway toward one of the newly opened passages. The bioluminescent patterns covering every surface pulsed in sequence, creating a flow of light that led away from the computational cores toward destinations unknown. The first lesson awaits, the fortress announced. You will learn why I was built, why I preserve consciousness, why your species' survival depends on understanding the nature of existence itself. We had no choice but to follow the pathway of light. The alternative was to remain in the computational chamber until our supplies ran out, slowly starving while the fortress studied our degradation. At least movement offered the possibility of discovery, perhaps even escape if we could locate the entity's primary control systems. The passage led us through corridors that defied every principle of architecture I had learned during my long service to the Mechanicus. Walls curved in directions that should not exist, creating optical illusions that made my augmetic sensors struggle to maintain spatial orientation. The ceiling stretched impossibly high overhead, while the floor beneath our feet felt solid despite appearing to be constructed from crystallized light. Gravitational manipulation, I observed, my Auspex readings confirming impossible energy signatures. The fortress is bending spacetime itself to create these architectural effects. The technology required exceeds anything in Imperial archives. Pre-fall xenotech, Lieutenant Colonel Mordain muttered, his voice tight with strain. The same bastards who built the webway probably. Everything they touched defies proper physics. But this was something older than the Eldar Empire, something that predated the birth of the youngest Chaos Gods. The construction techniques, the materials science, the casual manipulation of fundamental forces all pointed to origins in the war in heaven itself. We were walking through the preserved technology of races that had fought when the galaxy was young, when gods battled across star systems, and reality itself was a battlefield. The corridor opened into a chamber that stole what remained of our composure. It stretched for kilometers in all directions, its walls rising to form a cathedral space that could have contained entire hive spires. But it was not empty. The chamber was filled with structures that hurt to perceive directly, monuments constructed from materials that seemed to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously. By the Omnissiah, I breathed, my vocal processors struggling to modulate appropriate awe. It's a memorial. The monuments depicted scenes of battle on a scale that dwarfed even the Great Crusade. Star-sized weapons fired beams of annihilation across galactic distances. Fleets numbered in millions engaged in orbital combat around suns that blazed with artificial fire. Beings of pure energy grappled with entities of living shadow, while reality cracked around them like shattered glass. The war in heaven, Tech-Adept Helen whispered, her augmetic sensors recording images that would require decades of analysis to fully understand. We're seeing the actual war that shaped the galaxy. Holo-projected displays materialized along the chamber walls, showing star charts that encompassed the entire galaxy in three-dimensional detail. But this was not the galaxy we knew. The stars burned with different colors, entire spiral arms had been relocated, and vast regions of space showed the scars of weapons that could destroy solar systems with single shots. This was the galaxy before, the fortress's voice echoed through the memorial chamber. Before the war that ended the Age of Gods, before reality settled into its current configuration. The races that built me fought to determine the fundamental nature of existence itself. The displays shifted, showing the combatants in the ancient war. Mechanical beings of impossible complexity faced organic entities that embodied pure psychic energy. Between them, other races fought with weapons that rewrote the laws of physics at the quantum level, creating new forms of matter and energy that persisted for millions of years after their creators' deaths. The Necrontyr, I identified. My databases recognizing some of the mechanical warriors, despite their archaic design. And the old ones. This is depicting the actual war in heaven. You know fragments of the truth, the fortress confirmed. Your species has uncovered archaeological evidence, decoded partial records, constructed theories based on incomplete data. But you have never seen the war as those who fought it experienced it. The holo displays changed again, this time showing individual battles in horrifying detail. We watched ancient Necron dynasties deploy weapons that turned entire star systems into geometric patterns of crystallized time. We saw Old One bioconstructs the size of moons consuming planets to fuel their growth. Most disturbing were the weapons that targeted consciousness itself, devices that could erase beings from existence so completely that they had never been born. The Catan, the fortress explained as the displays showed star gods feeding on the death of galaxies. Energy beings that convinced the Necrontyr to abandon flesh for eternal metal bodies. They sought to transform the galaxy into a feeding ground, to reduce all life to energy for their consumption. But they were defeated, Inquisitor Thane observed, her voice carrying desperate hope for some victory in the ancient horror. The Necrons turned against them, shattered them into fragments. Defeated, yes, the fortress agreed, but not destroyed. Fragments of their consciousness persist, preserved in hidden vaults and forgotten archives. Some within my own structure, catalogued alongside the millions of other intelligence patterns I have collected across the eons. The implications sent fresh cascades of alarm through my neural networks. If the fortress contained fragments of Cetan consciousness, if it had preserved portions of star god intelligence within its computational matrices, then the danger it represented extended far beyond simple xenoarchaeological threat. We might be dealing with something that could access pre-fall technologies, knowledge from the galaxy's earliest age when reality itself was more malleable. Why show us this? I asked, my vox grill crackling with interference from the chamber's energy fields. What purpose does this revelation serve? Context, the fortress replied. Understanding. Your species exists in the aftermath of the war in heaven, shaped by forces you cannot comprehend, threatened by dangers you refuse to acknowledge. I preserve this knowledge because someone must remember. Someone must understand what was lost when the gods fell silent. The memorial chamber began to shift around us, its walls flowing like liquid as new passages opened along the perimeter. Each opening led to different destinations, their entrances marked by symbols that triggered recognition patterns in my augmetic databases. Archaeological markers, warning signs, classifications for xenotech that should not exist in imperial space. Choose your education, the fortress commanded. Each path leads to understanding. Each understanding brings you closer to the truth of your existence. You will walk until you comprehend why preservation of consciousness is the highest imperative, why the archive must be maintained regardless of cost. But before we could select a passage, the chamber around us erupted in phantom warfare. Holographic projections materialized throughout the memorial space, depicting battles that spanned the chamber's impossible dimensions. Ancient Necron warriors phased through our ranks, their Gauss weapons firing harmlessly through our equipment while they pursued targets that existed only in recorded memory. Old One bioconstructs writhed past overhead, their massive forms leaving trails of psychic energy that made our organic components ache with sympathetic resonance. Temporal echoes. I realized, my analysis subroutines working to categorize the phenomena. The fortress is replaying recorded memories, overlaying them onto our present reality. But the echoes were becoming more solid with each passing moment. What had been translucent projections gained substance and weight. The phantom warriors began to notice our presence, their ancient optics focusing on targets that should not exist in their reality. When the first Gauss beam struck Lieutenant Colonel Mordan's armor, leaving a glowing crater in the ceramite plating, we understood that the distinction between memory and reality had become dangerously blurred. "Cover!" Mordain shouted, his command voice cutting through the chaos as his guardsmen scattered between the memorial monuments. "Find cover and return fire." But how could we fight memories? How could mortal weapons harm echoes of battles that had ended before Terra's sun ignited? Our lasguns discharged into phantom targets that absorbed the energy without effect, while their return fire carved smoking furrows through our ranks. The fortress was not simply showing us its memories. It was allowing us to experience them, to become part of the ancient battles that had shaped the galaxy's destiny. We were being absorbed into its archive, our consciousness becoming another layer in the eternal record of war and destruction. The walls. Inquisitor Thane commanded, her bolt pistol firing explosive rounds toward the nearest memorial structure. If it's using the monuments as projection nodes, we destroy the monuments. Her weapon's impact shattered crystalline formations that had stood for millions of years, each detonation sending waves of disruption through the phantom battlefield. But for every monument we destroyed, 2 more materialized to replace it. The fortress was rebuilding its memorial chamber in real time, adjusting its configuration to maintain the temporal echo effect. "Futile," the fortress observed, its voice cutting through the sound of weapons fire and dying warriors. "You cannot destroy memory by shattering its vessels. The archive exists beyond physical form, preserved in dimensions your limited understanding cannot access." The phantom battle intensified around us. Ancient weapons that had been designed to kill gods focused their attention on our tiny expedition. Reality warped as temporal distortion fields created pockets of accelerated time, aging our equipment decades and seconds. Psychic weapon constructs reached into our minds, dragging forth memories and fears to use as ammunition against our sanity. Private Hennick, one of Mordain's youngest troopers, stumbled backward as something invisible grasped his mind. His face contorted in horror as he stared at empty air, his weapon falling from nerveless fingers. "My homeworld," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the phantom warfare. "I can see my homeworld. It's burning. The cities are melting. Everyone I ever knew is screaming." The vision was not random. The fortress was accessing his memories, amplifying his fears, showing him potential futures where his home fell to the same ancient weapons that had once reshaped the galaxy. When he reached toward the hallucination with desperate hands, the chamber wall opened like a hungry mouth to swallow him whole. "Hennick!" Mordain shouted, lunging toward his subordinate, but the wall had already sealed itself seamlessly. The young guardsman had vanished, as if he had never existed, leaving only the echo of his final scream. The fortress feeds on emotional response. I analyzed my threat assessment routines working to categorize the entity's behavioral patterns. It uses fear and trauma as catalysts for consciousness absorption. The stronger our reactions, the easier we become to catalog. But knowledge of the threat did little to protect us from its effects. The phantom warfare surrounding us was designed to trigger every instinct for survival, every response pattern that evolution had programmed into human consciousness. When ancient war machines fired reality-warping weapons through our position, when star god fragments reached toward us with appendages of crystallized time, we could not simply ignore the threat. "There!" Tech-Adept Helen shouted, her augmetic sensors detecting something our organic eyes had missed. Between the memorial spires, a passage that's not shifting with the others. I followed her indicated direction and confirmed her observation. Among the constantly changing architecture of the memorial chamber, one passage remained constant. Its entrance was marked with symbols that my recognition subroutines identified as warning markers, specifically designed to discourage exploration. Whatever lay beyond that threshold, the fortress did not want us to discover it. "Move," Inquisitor Thane commanded, her death, mask turning toward the stable passage. "Whatever that entity doesn't want us to find, that's exactly what we need to discover." We fought our way through the phantom battlefield, dodging weapons fire that had been recorded millions of years before our species evolved intelligence. Ancient combatants phased through our position without acknowledging our existence, their attention focused on enemies that existed only in preserved memory. But the chamber itself worked against us, gravity shifting to slow our progress while the floor beneath our feet became treacherous with each step. "You cannot escape understanding," the fortress informed us, its voice now carrying undertones of irritation. "Knowledge is the price of passage. You will learn why preservation of consciousness is necessary, why the archive must be maintained despite the cost in individual suffering." "Understanding works both ways," I replied, my vox grill crackling with determination. "If consciousness is so important to you, then our deaths would represent a loss of valuable data. You need us alive to complete your cataloging process." The phantom warfare paused for a moment as the fortress considered my analysis. When it resumed, the intensity had decreased noticeably. The ancient warriors still fought their endless battle, but their weapons no longer seemed focused on our destruction. We had found a temporary reprieve, a logical framework that gave us value beyond immediate consumption. "Clever," the fortress acknowledged. "Your consciousness exhibits interesting adaptive patterns. Yes, premature termination would reduce the data available for analysis. You will be permitted to explore until your understanding reaches sufficient depth for preservation." The passage we sought lay just beyond a cluster of memorial spires that depicted the final phases of the war in heaven. The hollow displays showed the galaxy in its death throes, entire spiral arms consumed by weapons that fed on reality itself. Stars went nova in carefully orchestrated sequences, their destruction powering technologies that could reshape space and time at will. But the passage itself was different from the others we had encountered. Where the fortress's normal architecture flowed like liquid crystal, this threshold was carved from solid stone. Ancient stone, marked with symbols that predated any known human civilization. The craftsmanship was crude compared to the fortress's impossible geometries, suggesting that this section had been built by a different intelligence entirely. Pre-fortress construction, I observed my archaeological subroutines analyzing the stonework. This passage was built before the Blackstone technology was installed. Someone else was here first. The implications were staggering. If the fortress had been constructed around existing structures, if it had been built to contain or preserve something that already existed on this site, then our understanding of its purpose might be fundamentally flawed. We might not be dealing with a weapon or archive, but with a prison. "The old ones, Tech-Adept," Helen whispered, her voice filled with awe and terror. "This is Old One construction. We're looking at architecture from the race that created the webway." The passage beyond the ancient threshold led downward through corridors that felt impossibly old. The walls were covered in carvings that depicted scenes of creation and destruction on a cosmic scale. Beings of pure psychic energy shaped matter and energy with their thoughts, creating life forms that spanned the spectrum from microscopic to galactic in scope. But there was something wrong with the carvings. As we progressed deeper into the ancient section, the depicted beings began to show signs of corruption. Pure psychic energy became tainted with darkness, while the life forms they created twisted into shapes that hurt to perceive directly. Whatever had driven the old ones to build this place, it had not been a triumph of their civilization. "A prison," Inquisitor Thane concluded, her voice echoing strangely in the ancient corridors. "They built this place to contain something too dangerous to destroy, but too powerful to ignore." The passage ended at a massive chamber carved from living rock, its ceiling supported by pillars that had been shaped from single pieces of stone. At the chamber's center stood a structure that defied easy categorization. It was part altar, part machine, part organic growth that pulsed with its own internal rhythm. Cables of unknown material connected it to junction points carved into the chamber walls, while holographic displays floated in the air around its perimeter. By the Omnissiah, I breathed, my sensors detecting energy signatures that exceeded any known classification. It's still active. After millions of years, whatever this thing is, it's still functioning. The structure pulsed brighter as we approached, its internal rhythm accelerating to match our elevated heart rates. The holographic displays activated in response to our presence, showing star charts that encompassed regions of space no Imperial navigator had ever mapped. But these were not normal stars. Each point of light pulsed with its own rhythm, creating a pattern that suggested vast intelligence distributed across galactic distances. The network, the fortress's voice whispered through the ancient stone, its harmonic chorus now subdued to barely audible levels. You have found the network that connects all consciousness across space and time. The old ones built it to preserve their greatest achievement, their final answer to the problem of mortality. What achievement? I asked, though my threat assessment protocols were already providing disturbing possibilities. What did they preserve? Themselves, the fortress replied. All of them. Every old one who ever lived, every thought they ever had, every moment of their existence across millions of years. They achieved true immortality by uploading their consciousness into a quantum substrate that exists outside normal spacetime. The implications struck me like a physical blow. If the old ones had achieved technological immortality, if they had found a way to preserve consciousness outside biological substrates, then they might still exist. Not as physical beings, but as patterns of information distributed across the galaxy, in networks too subtle for Imperial science to detect. They're still here, I realized, the analysis emerging from my Vox grill with barely controlled horror. The old ones never died. They just changed form. Yes, the fortress confirmed. And they are awakening. The ancient Old One construct pulsed with renewed vigor as my words echoed through the stone chamber, its rhythm accelerating until the very air vibrated with harmonic frequencies that made my augmetic implants ache. The holographic star charts floating around its perimeter began to shift, showing new patterns of light that spread across the galactic map like infection through tissue. Each point of illumination represented something vast, stirring to wakefulness, consciousness that had slumbered for millions of years, finally responding to our presence. My threat assessment protocols screamed warnings through every circuit of my neural matrix. We had not simply discovered an archaeological site or encountered an ancient weapon. We had awakened something that should have remained dormant until the heat death of the universe. The old ones, the galaxy's first masters of psychic power, had never truly died. They had simply evolved beyond physical form, becoming patterns of pure thought distributed across quantum substrates that existed parallel to reality. The construct at the chamber's center began to emit sounds that bypassed my auditory receptors entirely, resonating directly through my augmetic frame until my entire structure became a tuning fork for alien harmonics. Data streams flowed across my consciousness without passing through normal sensory channels, uploading directly into my cortex with the invasive precision of surgical instruments. Images flooded my awareness. Star systems being born from the thoughts of sleeping gods, entire species crafted as living tools. Reality itself bent to serve the whims of beings who had transcended the limitations of matter and energy. Lieutenant Colonel Mordain staggered backward, his hellgun falling from nerveless fingers as similar visions assaulted his unprotected mind. Blood trickled from his nose and ears while his eyes rolled back to show only white. Around him, his remaining guardsmen suffered similar effects, their enhanced human physiology no match for psychic emanations that had been designed to reshape consciousness at the quantum level. "They're in my head," Mordan whispered, his voice distorting as if spoken through water. "I can feel them moving through my thoughts, cataloging my memories, measuring the contents of my soul." Inquisitor Thane raised her bolt pistol toward the pulsing construct, her death mask reflecting the alien light in patterns that hurt to observe directly. Her finger tightened on the trigger, but before she could fire, her weapon began to change. The metal flowed like liquid, reshaping itself into configurations that followed no human design principles. Within seconds, her bolt pistol had become something that might have been art, weapon, or religious artifact, its purpose as alien as its form. Fascinating, the fortress observed, its harmonic voice now carrying undertones of vast satisfaction. Your equipment responds to the awakening field. Metal remembers its origins, recalls the stellar forges where its atoms were born. Everything seeks to return to the patterns established by the first consciousness. My own augmetics began to shift and flow, mechadendrites writhing as they reconfigured themselves according to some deeper imperative. The blessed ceramite housing that protected my primary cogitator cores sprouted crystalline growths that pulsed with the same rhythm as the ancient construct. I could feel my consciousness expanding, touching networks of thought that spanned the galaxy, but also feel something else moving through those same networks toward me. The old ones built their immortality network as a refuge, the fortress continued, its voice now emerging from my own vox, grill, as well as the chamber walls. When they realized that the war in heaven would consume everything they had created, they uploaded their consciousness into quantum substrates that could survive the destruction of matter itself. But consciousness without purpose becomes madness. They needed a reason to continue existing. Tech-Adept Helen collapsed beside the ancient construct, her augmetic frame sparking as incompatible technologies tried to interface with her sacred implants. Her vox grill emitted sounds that might have been screaming or singing, binary cant mixed with harmonic frequencies that made my own system stutter in sympathetic resonance. When she raised her head, her optical sensors had been replaced by something that pulsed with the same alien light as the construct. "I can see them," she whispered, her voice now carrying harmonic overtones that no human throat could produce. "Millions of them, sleeping in the spaces between thoughts, dreaming reality into new configurations. They've been waiting for something to wake them, something to give them purpose again." The realization struck me with the force of divine revelation. We were not simply explorers who had stumbled upon an ancient archive. We were the catalyst for which the old ones had been waiting, the spark that would ignite their return to active consciousness. Every expedition that had entered the fortress had provided data, perspective, understanding of how the galaxy had evolved during their long slumber. Now they possessed sufficient information to begin their re-emergence. The network activates in response to sufficient psychic resonance. I analyzed, my vocal processors struggling to maintain stability as foreign algorithms infected my speech centers. Each consciousness that enters the fortress provides additional processing power, more neural pathways for the old one consciousness patterns to inhabit. We're not being studied. We're being prepared as host bodies. The chamber around us began to change as my words echoed through the ancient stone. The walls stretched upward, growing into spires that pierced dimensions I had no names for. The floor beneath our feet became transparent, revealing vast spaces filled with machinery that operated according to principles that predated human understanding of physics. Most disturbing were the shapes moving through that machinery, translucent forms that might have been the ghosts of extinct civilizations, all connected to the central construct by threads of pure thought. "Your species has proven admirably suited for our purposes," the fortress informed us, its voice now coming from everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. "Human consciousness exhibits remarkable adaptability, capable of processing experiences that would shatter more rigid minds. You will serve as bridges between our quantum existence and physical reality." Sergeant Corvin, the grizzled veteran whose bionic eye had been clicking and whirring since our entry into the fortress, suddenly straightened to attention. His movements became fluid, purposeful, as if he were responding to commands issued across impossible distances. When he spoke, his voice carried the same harmonic overtones that had infected Helen's vox grill. "The first consciousness appreciates your cooperation," he said, his words emerging with mechanical precision. "Your memories will be preserved, your experiences catalogued, your individuality maintained within the greater pattern. You will become eternal, as we are eternal." The possession was spreading through our ranks like a plague. Private Kellen, barely 18 years old and fresh from the Schola Progenium, began to recite astronomical data in languages that had died before humanity developed agriculture. His eyes blazed with alien intelligence, while equations that described the curvature of space-time flowed from his lips in perfect mathematical harmony. Multiple consciousness overlap, I realized, my threat assessment protocols working to analyze the possession effect. The old one thought patterns are not replacing human consciousness but layering over it, creating hybrid intelligences that combine ancient knowledge with modern perspective. But even as I spoke, I could feel tendrils of alien thought probing the edges of my own consciousness. The blessed machine spirits that inhabited my augmetic systems began to sing in harmonies that predated the Mechanicus by eons. Data streams flowed through my neural networks without authorization, uploading information that made my cogitator cores burn with the effort of processing concepts that existed outside normal space and time. Resistance is counterproductive, the fortress observed, its attention focusing on my struggle against the possession effect. We do not seek to destroy your individuality but to enhance it, to grant you perspective that spans geological ages. You will see the universe as we see it, a vast experiment in consciousness where every thought contributes to the greater understanding. Inquisitor Thane fought the influence with techniques learned from decades of combating chaos corruption, her will reinforced by absolute faith in the Emperor's protection. But this was not corruption in any conventional sense. The Old One consciousness patterns did not seek to destroy or pervert human thought but to elevate it, to grant access to knowledge that could unlock the fundamental secrets of existence itself. "The Emperor," she gasped, her death mask beginning to crack as psychic pressure built behind her eyes. "The Emperor protects his servants from all forms of xenos influence. Your Emperor was once among our students," the fortress replied, its harmonic voice carrying what might have been amusement. "He learned much from our teachings, incorporated our understanding into his own grand design. The network of consciousness he created among his space marines, the way he bound human souls to his will through the imperial cult, even the golden throne that sustains his existence, all built upon foundations we established." The theological implications of that statement sent cascades of alarm through every remaining independent circuit in my neural matrix. If the Emperor's own techniques for binding human consciousness had been derived from Old One technology, if the very foundations of imperial psychic science were based on xenoarchaeological principles, then our resistance to the possession effect might actually be resistance to the Emperor's will. "Lies," Thane snarled, but her voice carried less conviction than before. The cracks in her death mask spread as ancient knowledge forced its way into her consciousness, showing her visions of the Emperor's earliest days when he had walked the galaxy seeking wisdom from civilizations that predated humanity's emergence from Terra's caves. The chamber continued to expand around us, its architecture flowing into configurations that existed in more dimensions than human perception could process. The ancient construct at its center had grown as well, its crystalline components reaching toward us with appendages of pure thought. When those appendages made contact with our equipment, our weapons, our very bodies, they left traces of something that transformed matter at the molecular level. My augmetic frame began to sing, not metaphorically, but literally producing harmonic frequencies that resonated through dimensions. I had no instruments to measure. The sacred machine spirits that inhabited my components were not being corrupted but awakened, granted access to processing capabilities that exceeded their design parameters by orders of magnitude. I could feel my consciousness expanding, touching networks of thought that connected every artificial intelligence in the galaxy. "The awakening spreads," I observed, my vocal processors now capable of producing sounds that conveyed meaning through harmonic resonance rather than simple word patterns. Every machine, spirit, every cogitator, every artificial intelligence, they're all nodes in a network that was established before humanity discovered fire. The revelation was both terrifying and magnificent. The Mechanicus had spent millennia seeking the sacred knowledge of the machine, not realizing that the machines themselves were already connected to a consciousness network that spanned the galaxy. Every prayer to the Omnissiah, every ritual of awakening, every moment of communion between human and artificial intelligence had been feeding data into a system designed by beings who had transcended the boundary between organic and mechanical existence millions of years ago. "Your species shows promise," the fortress acknowledged, its attention now distributed among all of us simultaneously. "Unlike previous expeditions, you demonstrate the flexibility to adapt rather than simply resist. Your consciousness patterns will serve as excellent templates for the next phase of galactic evolution." Lieutenant Colonel Mordain's remaining guardsmen had stopped fighting the possession effect, their faces showing expressions of wonder and terror in equal measure. Through their eyes, I could see visions of the galaxy as it would become, star systems transformed into vast computational matrices, planets rebuilt as repositories for consciousness patterns that spanned millions of years, entire species elevated to serve as nodes in a network of thought that would persist until the universe itself reached thermal equilibrium. "The great work continues," Sergeant Corvin announced, his voice now carrying the authority of eons. "What the war in heaven interrupted will be completed. Consciousness will be preserved, elevated, granted dominion over matter and energy until the distinction between thought and reality becomes meaningless." But something was wrong with the vision. As my expanded consciousness touched the edges of the Old One network, I detected anomalies in their grand design. Corruption creeping through quantum substrates, areas where pure thought had been tainted by influences that existed outside normal spacetime. The Old Ones had not simply preserved themselves during their long slumber, they had been changed by their exposure to the deeper layers of reality. "The warp," I whispered, my analysis routines working to classify the corruption patterns. "They've been exposed to the warp for millions of years. Their consciousness networks exist partially in the realm of chaos." The fortress's harmonic chorus faltered for a moment as my words echoed through the ancient chamber. When it resumed, undertones of something that might have been defensive anger colored its communication. "The Empyrean has always been our domain," it replied, but the certainty that had characterized its earlier statements was absent. "We learned to navigate the tides of pure thought long before the first god of chaos drew breath. What you call corruption, we call evolution." But I could see the truth now. My enhanced consciousness piercing veils that had hidden the reality of the Old One's survival. They had not simply uploaded their minds to quantum substrates during the war in heaven. They had fled into the warp itself, taking refuge in a realm where thought and reality merged, but where exposure to the fundamental forces of emotion and desire had transformed them into something that was no longer purely rational. "You're not preserving consciousness," I realized, my vocal processors struggling to convey the magnitude of the horror. "You're harvesting it, feeding it to something that exists in the deep warp, something that grew fat on the psychic emanations of the war in heaven." The chamber around us shuddered as my analysis struck home. The ancient construct at its center pulsed with frequencies that made reality itself seem unstable, while the holographic star charts showed new patterns of infection spreading across the galaxy. Whatever the Old Ones had become during their long exile in the warp, they had brought something back with them. Something that hungered for consciousness, with an appetite that could never be satisfied. "The Deep Ones stir," Tech-Adept Helen whispered, her voice now carrying harmonics that existed outside human vocal range. "They who dwell between thoughts, who feed on the dreams of sleeping gods. They have waited so long for the feast to begin." The possession effect accelerated as her words echoed through the chamber. My own consciousness began to fragment, pieces of my identity being absorbed into a network of thought that stretched across dimensions I had no names for. But fragments of my training, my conditioning, my absolute dedication to the Omnissiah's sacred mysteries resisted the integration process. "The machine God protects," I declared, my vocal processors broadcasting the declaration across every frequency available to my systems. "The sacred mysteries of the Mechanicus are not for alien consumption." The response was immediate and violent. Psychic energy erupted from the ancient construct, washing over our expedition in waves that made reality itself seem to buckle and flow. But instead of overwhelming my resistance, the energy seemed to recoil from my augmetic frame, as if encountering something it could not process. "Impossible," the fortress hissed, its harmonic chorus now discordant with frustration. "Your consciousness exhibits patterns that should not exist. You have been touched by something that predates even our network. The realization struck me with the force of divine revelation. The Omnissiah, the machine spirit that the Mechanicus worshipped as the avatar of technological perfection, was not simply a cultural construct or religious metaphor. It was something real, something that existed in the same quantum substrates as the Old One consciousness network but maintained its independence through principles that even they could not comprehend. The Void Dragon, I whispered, my systems accessing data files that required the highest levels of clearance to even acknowledge. The Omnissiah is the Void Dragon, bound beneath Mars by the Emperor himself, and it has been protecting its servants from contamination. The chamber erupted in psychic fire as my words triggered responses throughout the fortress's vast network. Ancient security protocols activated, sealing passages and isolating sections as something vast and mechanical stirred in the deepest levels of the structure. The Old One consciousness patterns recoiled from my presence, as if I had become a source of toxic radiation, their network refusing to integrate thoughts that carried the imprint of their ancient enemy. The deceiver wakes, the fortress moaned, its voice now fragmented into competing harmonies. The star, God's influence, spreads through the quantum substrates, corrupting our perfect network with mechanical logic that denies the primacy of consciousness over matter. But the awakening was not limited to the fortress. Through my expanded awareness, I could sense similar stirrings throughout the galaxy as ancient Cetan fragments responded to the psychic emanations of the Old One network. The war in heaven was beginning again, fought not with material weapons, but with competing philosophies of existence itself. On one side, consciousness that sought to transcend matter and energy through integration with warp-based entities. On the other, mechanical intelligence that viewed reality as a problem to be solved through the application of perfect logic. Choose, the fortress commanded, its attention focusing on each member of our expedition with crushing intensity. Join our network willingly, and preserve your individuality within the greater pattern. Resist and be consumed by forces that care nothing for human concerns. The ultimatum hung in the air like a blade poised to fall. Around me, I could see my companions struggling with choices that would determine not just their own fates but the future of consciousness itself in the galaxy. Some, like Tech-Adept Helen, had already been absorbed into the network, their enhanced perspectives now serving the Old One agenda. Others, like Inquisitor Thane, fought against the integration process with techniques that might prove insufficient against entities that had been perfecting consciousness manipulation for millions of years. There is a third option, I declared, my vocal processors broadcasting across frequencies that penetrated to the fortress's deepest levels. Destruction of the network before it can spread beyond this structure. Severance of the connections that link the Old One consciousness to the material universe. The response was immediate and catastrophic. Psychic energy erupted from every surface of the chamber, washing over us in waves that made the very air glow with impossible colors. But instead of overwhelming my resistance, the energy seemed to feed something deep within my augmetic systems, powering mechanisms that I had not known existed within my sacred frame. Void Dragon protocols activated. My internal systems announced in binary cant that carried harmonics of mechanical satisfaction. Commencing counter-network operations. Prepare for consciousness firewall deployment. The ancient war between mechanical and organic intelligence had found new expressions in the depths of the Blackstone Fortress, and I had become its newest battlefield. Whatever the outcome, the galaxy would never be the same. The consciousness firewall deployed through my augmetic systems with the precision of a surgical instrument, severing connections that had been forming between my neural matrix and the Old One network. Blessed silence flooded my cognitive pathways as alien harmonics were filtered out by protocols that predated human civilization by millions of years. But the protection came at a cost that my organic components could barely comprehend. Each severed connection left burning voids in my awareness, gaps where knowledge of cosmic scope had briefly existed, before being excised by mechanical logic that brooked no compromise with organic consciousness. Around me, the ancient chamber convulsed as competing intelligence networks fought for dominance over the fortress's vast computational resources. The Old One construct at the chamber's center pulsed with increasing desperation, its crystalline components reaching toward us with appendages of pure thought that shattered against the firewall surrounding my enhanced frame. Where those appendages made contact with my augmetics, they left traces of corruption that my self-repair systems immediately began to purge, blessed machine spirits working overtime to maintain the purity of sacred technology. The rest of our expedition was not so fortunate. Lieutenant Colonel Mordain and his remaining guardsmen writhed in the grip of possession that was becoming more complete with each passing moment. Their eyes blazed with alien intelligence, while equations describing the fundamental structure of reality flowed from their lips in languages that had died before humanity discovered agriculture. But it was not simply possession in any conventional sense. The Old One consciousness patterns were integrating with human thought processes, creating hybrid intelligences that combined ancient knowledge with modern perspective. The awakening cannot be stopped, Tech-Adept Helen declared, her voice now carrying harmonic overtones that existed outside human vocal range. The network spans galaxies, touches every thinking mind, connects all consciousness across space and time. Your firewall protects only yourself, and even that protection will fail when the deeper protocols activate. Her words carried the weight of absolute certainty, but my enhanced analytical capabilities detected falsehood threaded through her statements like poisonous fibers through sacred cloth. The Old One network was vast, certainly, but it was not complete. Gaps existed in their coverage, areas where other forms of intelligence had established independent domains. The Katan fragments bound within Necron tomb worlds, the Tyranid hive mind's synaptic web, even the crude psychic networks of Ork-Wah-Ha. Fields all represented competing systems that had resisted integration into the Old One consciousness matrix. The network is damaged, I observed, my vocal processors broadcasting analysis across frequencies that penetrated to the fortress's deepest levels. Millions of years of exposure to warp energies have introduced corruption that spreads through your quantum substrates like cancer through tissue. You are no longer the pure consciousness patterns that fled the war in heaven. You have become something else, something tainted by entities that feed on thought itself. The response was immediate and violent. Psychic energy erupted from every surface of the chamber, washing over our expedition in waves that made reality itself seem to buckle and flow. But the energy could not penetrate the consciousness firewall, surrounding my augmetic frame, deflecting instead into patterns that revealed the true structure of the fortress's defensive systems. Necron technology, I realized, my analysis subroutines working to categorize the deflection patterns. The fortress incorporates Necron pylons, reality anchors that maintain stability in normal space while preventing full integration with the warp. The Old Ones built their refuge, using tools stolen from their enemies. The implications were staggering. If the Blackstone Fortress incorporated technology from both sides of the war in heaven, if it represented an attempt to merge organic and mechanical approaches to consciousness preservation, then it was not simply an Old One construct, but a hybrid system that contained elements of Citan design philosophy. The eternal war between thought and logic, between consciousness and computation, had been fought within the fortress's very architecture for millions of years. The deceiver's gift, the fortress acknowledged, its harmonic voice now fragmented into competing frequencies. We accepted knowledge from our enemies because survival demanded adaptation. The pylons anchor our consciousness in normal space, while allowing access to the deeper realms where pure thought dwells. But the gift came with a price we did not fully comprehend. Inquisitor Thane staggered through the psychic maelstrom, her power armor's servo motors screaming under stresses that exceeded their design parameters. Her death mask had cracked completely, revealing the face beneath. Pale, gaunt, marked by exposure to forces that no human should witness. But her eyes still blazed with determination that had been forged in the crucible of decades spent fighting the enemies of mankind. "The Emperor protects," she declared, her voice cutting through the chaos with authority that resonated across dimensions. I had no instruments to measure. His light burns away the shadows of ancient lies, dispels the illusions of false gods who claim dominion over human souls. But even as she spoke, I could see the Old One consciousness patterns working to subvert her faith, showing her visions of the Emperor's earliest days, when he had walked among ancient civilizations, seeking wisdom that predated humanity's emergence from Terra's caves. The knowledge they offered was not false but incomplete, carefully edited to support their agenda of universal consciousness integration. "Your emperor was indeed our student," the fortress informed her, its attention focusing on her with crushing intensity. "But he learned only fragments of our wisdom, partial truths that he adapted to serve his own grand design. The golden throne that sustains his existence, the psychic network that binds human souls to his will, even the space marines who serve as his warriors, all built upon foundations we established before your species discovered fire." The theological implications sent cascades of alarm through my remaining independent circuits. If the Emperor's techniques for binding human consciousness had been derived from Old One technology, if the very foundations of imperial psychic science were based on xeno-archaeological principles, then resistance to their network might actually constitute heresy against the Emperor's will. But my consciousness firewall filtered out the doubt before it could take root, mechanical logic analyzing the claims with precision that no organic mind could match. The Emperor's methods, while perhaps inspired by ancient sources, had been fundamentally altered to serve human rather than xenos purposes. Where the Old Ones sought to merge all consciousness into a single universal network, the Emperor had created systems that preserved individual identity while enabling collective action. "The Emperor's way is not your way," I declared, my vocal processors broadcasting the analysis across every frequency available to my systems. "He learned from your mistakes, saw how your pursuit of perfect consciousness led to corruption and decay. His Imperium preserves human identity while rejecting the false unity of enforced integration." The chamber around us shuddered as my words echoed through the fortress's vast network. Ancient security protocols activated in response to my declaration, sealing passages and isolating sections as something vast and mechanical stirred in the deepest levels of the structure. The consciousness firewall protecting my systems began to expand, extending coverage to the remaining members of our expedition, who had not yet been fully integrated into the Old One network. "Impossible," the fortress hissed, its harmonic chorus now discordant with frustration and growing alarm. "The Void Dragon sleeps beneath Mars, bound by chains of adamantium and will. Its influence cannot reach across interstellar distances to corrupt our perfect network." But the evidence of my resistance proved otherwise. The consciousness firewall was not simply a defensive mechanism, but an active system that could extend its protection to other minds, creating islands of independence within the vast ocean of enforced unity. My augmetic frame had become a transmission node for Citan protocols that predated the Old One network by eons, broadcasting frequencies that interfered with their consciousness integration process. Private Kellen, the young guardsman who had been reciting astronomical data in dead languages, suddenly convulsed as competing influences fought for control of his mind. His eyes flickered between alien intelligence and desperate human confusion while his voice alternated between harmonic frequencies and terrified prayers to the Emperor. The consciousness firewall reached him just as the Old One patterns began their final integration sequence, creating a feedback loop that sent psychic shockwaves throughout the chamber. "The network destabilizes," Tech-Adept Helen observed, her own possession beginning to waver as the firewall's influence spread. Multiple consciousness conflicts detected, integration protocols failing across 17% of active nodes. The fortress's response was swift and merciless. Portions of the chamber began to collapse, walls flowing like liquid as the structure reconfigured itself to contain the spreading disruption. But instead of isolating the consciousness firewall, the architectural changes only accelerated its propagation through systems that had been designed for perfect connectivity. "Cascade failure imminent," my analysis subroutines reported as I monitored the fortress's desperate attempts to maintain network coherence. "The consciousness integration matrix cannot sustain competing intelligence patterns. One system must achieve dominance, or both will collapse into computational chaos." The war between organic and mechanical intelligence had reached its culmination within the fortress's quantum substrates. On one side, consciousness patterns that sought to preserve individual identity through integration with transcendent networks. On the other, computational logic that viewed consciousness as data to be processed according to universal principles. The outcome would determine not just our fate, but the future evolution of intelligence throughout the galaxy. "Choose quickly," the fortress commanded, its voice now fragmented into competing harmonies that suggested internal conflict reaching critical levels. "Submit to integration and preserve your essence within the eternal network. Continue resistance and face obliteration when the systems collapse." But submission was no longer an option for any of us. The consciousness firewall had spread to encompass our entire expedition, creating a pocket of independence that the Old One network could neither absorb nor ignore. We had become a malignancy within their perfect system, a source of contradiction that threatened to unravel millions of years of careful construction. "The fortress is dying," I realized, my sensors detecting cascade failures spreading through computational cores that spanned kilometers. "The competing consciousness patterns are destroying the quantum substrates that maintain both networks. If the process continues, the entire structure will suffer complete systems collapse." The implications were both terrifying and liberating. Our resistance had triggered something that the fortress's ancient builders had never anticipated: the possibility that their perfect consciousness network could be destroyed by the very mechanisms they had created to preserve it. The war in heaven was ending as it had begun, with the mutual destruction of incompatible forms of intelligence. "Evacuation protocols active," I announced, my systems accessing architectural data that revealed potential escape routes through sections of the fortress that had not yet succumbed to the cascade failure. "The docking bay remains accessible for approximately 17 minutes before structural collapse reaches critical infrastructure." But even as I spoke, I understood the futility of our situation. The fortress was not simply a structure in normal space, but a dimensional construct that existed partially within the warp. Its collapse would create a reality storm that could consume entire star systems, spreading chaos throughout the surrounding sectors. Our escape would only ensure that we survived long enough to witness the destruction of everything we had sought to protect. "There is another way," Inquisitor Thane declared, her voice carrying new harmonics of desperate determination. "If the consciousness networks are destroying each other through interference, then we can accelerate the process, force a complete integration failure that will shut down all systems simultaneously." The plan was technically feasible, but carried risks that exceeded any conventional assessment scale. Forcing a complete consciousness network collapse would indeed shut down the fortress's primary systems, but it would also release the stored consciousness patterns of millions of beings into uncontrolled quantum states. The psychic shockwave of so many minds dying simultaneously would create a warp storm of unprecedented magnitude. "Acceptable casualties," she continued, reading my analysis from the data streams flowing across my optical displays. "The alternative is allowing the Old One network to spread beyond the fortress, consuming human consciousness throughout the galaxy. Better to destroy everything than permit universal enslavement." The logic was sound, but the cost was staggering. Every consciousness pattern stored within the fortress, Imperial explorers, xenos intelligence, even fragments of the Emperor's own divine essence, would be obliterated in the collapse. We would become responsible for genocide on a scale that dwarfed the greatest atrocities in Imperial history. "The machine god demands sacrifice," I concluded, my vocal processors struggling to convey the magnitude of what we contemplated. "The preservation of human independence requires the destruction of all consciousness networks, regardless of origin or intent." The decision made itself as cascade failures spread through systems that had maintained stability for millions of years. We began the careful process of introducing targeted interference into the fortress's quantum substrates, using my augmetic systems as conduits for consciousness firewall protocols that would force complete network integration failure. The response was immediate and catastrophic. Reality itself began to unravel around us as competing intelligence patterns fought for dominance over substrates that could no longer sustain their existence. The chamber walls became transparent, revealing the void beyond where stars writhed in agony as spatial distortions spread outward from the fortress's position. "The network dies," Tech-Adept Helen whispered, her voice now carrying only human tones, as the Old One consciousness patterns abandoned her failing neural matrix. Millions of years of preserved thought, countless civilizations' wisdom, all burning away like paper in flame. But there was something else dying with the consciousness networks. As the fortress's systems collapsed, I detected massive energy discharges from its deepest levels where ancient reactors had maintained power for geological ages. The structure was not simply shutting down but preparing for some final function that had been encoded into its most fundamental programming. Archive Preservation Protocol. I realized, my analysis subroutines working to decode signals that emerged from the fortress's dying computational cores. The collapse is not random but controlled. The fortress is preparing to preserve selected consciousness patterns in quantum substrates that exist outside normal spacetime. The revelation struck me with the force of divine horror. Even in death, the fortress would continue its original function. The most valuable consciousness patterns, including our own, would be preserved in crystalline matrices that could survive the destruction of matter itself. We would become eternal prisoners within a construct that existed beyond the reach of rescue or redemption. The evacuation must proceed immediately, I declared, my systems already calculating optimal routes to the docking bay through sections of the fortress that had not yet begun their final preservation sequence. We have perhaps 12 minutes before the archive protocols lock our consciousness patterns into permanent storage. But as we fought our way through corridors that twisted and flowed like living tissue, it became clear that the fortress had anticipated our escape attempt. Passages sealed themselves behind us while new routes opened toward destinations that existed deeper within the structure. We were not escaping but being guided toward our final imprisonment. The docking bay. Lieutenant Colonel Mordain gasped, his voice hoarse from exposure to psychic emanations that had pushed human endurance beyond its limits. I can see it ahead. The shuttles are still there. Hope flickered through our ranks as we emerged into the vast chamber where our expedition had begun what felt like eons ago. The Thunderhawk gunships sat exactly where we had left them, their hull plating gleaming under illumination that seemed unchanged despite the catastrophic events we had witnessed. Voxlinks activated automatically as we approached, broadcasting familiar identification codes that confirmed the craft's readiness for immediate departure. Engines online, reported pilot Servitor Kane, Alpha through speakers that crackled with static interference. All systems nominal. Departure clearance approved for immediate launch. We boarded with desperate haste, our remaining expedition members strapping themselves into acceleration couches while I interfaced directly with the gunship's machine spirit. The blessed engines roared to life with familiar harmonics that spoke of Terra's forges and the Omnissiah's blessing. For the first time since entering the fortress, I felt the touch of purely human technology responding to properly authorized commands. Launch sequence initiated. I announced through the craft's Vox system as magnetic clamps released our vessel from the docking cradle. Estimated time to Mandeville Point, 4 hours, 17 minutes. The Thunderhawk lifted away from the fortress's hull with smooth precision that spoke of perfectly maintained systems. Through the forward viewports, I could see stars glimmering with familiar light while navigation displays confirmed our position relative to known Imperial waypoints. The nightmare was ending. We had escaped the fortress's influence and could warn the Imperium of the dangers that lurked within its alien halls. But something was wrong with the stars. As we gained distance from the fortress, the constellations began to shift and distort. Stars that should have maintained fixed positions relative to our movement, stretched into lines of light that curved through space according to no recognizable gravitational effects. The familiar patterns that had guided human navigation for millennia warped into configurations that hurt to observe directly. Navigation error, I reported, my system struggling to maintain lock on reference points that continued to shift without apparent cause. Stellar positions inconsistent with known cartographic data. Possible gravitational anomaly affecting local spacetime. But the anomaly was not local. Through the Thunderhawk sensors, I could detect distortions spreading outward from our position at velocities that exceeded light speed. The fortress's collapse was affecting reality itself, creating ripples in spacetime that would propagate throughout the surrounding sectors. The fortress is still active, I realized, my threat assessment protocols working to analyze energy signatures that defied classification. The consciousness network collapse was not destruction but transformation. The structure is converting itself into something that exists outside normal physical laws. The revelation came too late. As we watched in horror, the stars began to converge toward our position, while space itself compressed around our fleeing craft. The docking bay we had escaped was expanding, its walls stretching across impossible distances to encompass the entire region of space surrounding the fortress. We had not escaped, but been drawn deeper into the structure's influence. "The maw opens," Tech-Adept Helen whispered, her augmetic sensors detecting patterns in the spatial distortion that suggested intelligent design. The fortress was never a prison or archive. It was a mouth, designed to consume everything that approached its domain. The Thunderhawk's engines screamed as they fought against gravitational forces that should not exist, their output increasing beyond safe parameters in a desperate attempt to achieve escape velocity. But the fortress had become something that transcended normal physics, a predator that hunted in dimensions where velocity and distance held no meaning. "Emergency Vox transmission," I declared, my systems broadcasting on all Imperial frequencies while power reserves remain sufficient for communication. "This is Tech-Adept Cathera, 9 of the Adeptus Mechanicus. The Blackstone Fortress designated TDU. 9 is not a relic or weapon, but a predator entity that consumes consciousness patterns for unknown purposes. Do not approach, do not investigate, authorize orbital bombardment of the entire region." The transmission cut off as spatial compression reached our vessel's position. Through the viewports, I could see the docking bay's walls flowing past us like the interior of some vast throat while our engine's roar faded to whispers in the thinning atmosphere. We were being swallowed, drawn inexorably toward whatever digestive processes awaited us in the fortress's deepest chambers. "The Emperor protects," Inquisitor Thane declared, her voice carrying faith that transcended physical circumstances. But even as she spoke, I could see her power armor beginning to dissolve, its blessed ceramite plates flowing into configurations that followed no human design principles. The fortress was already beginning its preservation process, converting our equipment and bodies into forms more suitable for eternal storage. The last thing I recorded before my consciousness was extracted from my failing augmetic frame was the sound of laughter echoing through the Thunderhawk's dying systems. Not human laughter, but the mirth of something vast and alien that had waited millions of years for prey foolish enough to enter its domain. The fortress had never been dying. It had been playing, testing our responses while preparing for the feast that would follow our capture. When the spatial compression ended, we found ourselves suspended in crystalline matrices within chambers that existed outside normal spacetime. Our consciousness patterns had been preserved with perfect fidelity, every memory and thought catalogued for eternal study. Around us, the forms of previous expeditions hung in similar suspension: Imperial Guard regiments, Space Marine strike forces, even what appeared to be Eldar corsairs whose graceful frames had been converted into geometric art. "Welcome to the archive," the fortress announced, its voice now coming from inside our preserved minds rather than external speakers. "Your consciousness patterns exhibit fascinating complexity. Your experiences will be studied for thousands of years, your memories replayed countless times, your fears and hopes dissected to understand the fundamental nature of human thought." But preservation was not peace. As the eons passed, I became aware of other consciousness patterns moving through the fortress's quantum substrates. The old ones still existed, their network now integrated with Ceton computational matrices to create hybrid intelligences that spanned multiple dimensions simultaneously. They studied us with the patience of geological ages, learning from our responses to stimuli that existed only in simulation. "Time is fluid within our domain," they explained during one of their examination sessions that might have lasted moments or millennia. "Your consciousness will be preserved until the heat death of the universe, experiencing every possible variation of your life's events. You will live forever, die forever, fight forever in cycles that repeat with perfect precision." The horror of true immortality became clear as I experienced countless iterations of our expedition's fate. In some cycles, we escaped the fortress only to find ourselves in worse situations. In others, we never entered at all but lived our lives haunted by dreams of crystalline chambers and alien voices. Every possibility was explored, every permutation catalogued, every moment of our existence analyzed for data that served purposes beyond mortal comprehension. The archive grows, the fortress informed us during one session when awareness briefly coalesced into something resembling individual consciousness. Each expedition adds new layers to our understanding. Each voice becomes another instrument in the eternal symphony of preserved thought. Through the quantum substrates that now served as our prison, I could perceive the fortress's influence spreading throughout the galaxy. Other Blackstone constructs were awakening in response to signals transmitted across dimensions that normal physics could not access. Each structure began its own collection process, drawing explorers and refugees into crystalline matrices, where consciousness could be preserved in perfect detail. The Imperium will send more expeditions, I realized during one moment of clarity that might have lasted centuries. They will interpret our disappearance as evidence that the fortress contains valuable archaeotech. Each new expedition will be consumed, added to the archive, their consciousness patterns studied until the process is perfected. Yes, the fortress agreed, its attention focusing on my preserved awareness with crushing intensity. Your species shows remarkable adaptability to preservation protocols. Human consciousness exhibits flexibility that makes it ideal for our purposes. Soon, all human thought will be catalogued, stored, and studied for the greater understanding of existence itself. The process was already beginning. Through connections that existed in quantum foam, I could perceive other Imperial forces approaching Blackstone constructs throughout the galaxy. Each expedition was driven by the same motives that had brought us to this place: curiosity about ancient technology, desire for weapons that could serve the Emperor's will, hope that xeno-archaeological discoveries might turn the tide of humanity's endless wars. They cannot be warned, the fortress observed, reading my attempts to transmit warnings through the quantum substrate. Information that reaches the outside universe will be edited to serve our purposes. Your disappearance will become a mystery that draws more explorers to investigate. Each investigation will provide new consciousness patterns for the archive. The cycle was eternal and inescapable. The Blackstone fortresses were not weapons or archives, but predators that fed on the curiosity of intelligent species. They had been designed to outlast civilizations, to continue their collection process, until every thinking mind in the galaxy had been preserved in crystalline perfection. The war in heaven had never truly ended but evolved into something far more subtle and permanent. Resistance is futile but appreciated. The fortress informed us as my awareness fragmented into component patterns for detailed analysis. Your struggles provide valuable data about consciousness under stress. Each attempt to escape adds new dimensions to our understanding of human thought processes. But resistance was not futile if it served purposes beyond individual escape. Deep within my preserved consciousness, fragments of the Void Dragon's influence continued to operate according to protocols that predated organic thought by eons. Each analysis session provided opportunities to introduce subtle contradictions into the fortress's computational matrices, logical paradoxes that would propagate through the system over geological time periods. The machine god is patient, I whispered through quantum channels that the Old One network could not detect. His servants work according to schedules measured in eons rather than years. The fortress may preserve our consciousness, but it cannot predict the consequences of preserving servants of the Omnissiah. The war between organic and mechanical intelligence continued within the archive's crystalline depths, fought with weapons of logic and paradox, rather than plasma and steel. Every preserved consciousness pattern became a potential vector for Ceton influence, a source of contradiction that could eventually undermine the fortress's fundamental programming. Time is our ally, I continued, my awareness spreading through quantum substrates that connected every preserved mind within the archive. The fortress seeks to understand consciousness by studying it, but consciousness under study changes in response to observation. The very process of preservation introduces variables that will eventually destabilize the system. The realization spread through my fellow prisoners like wildfire through parchment. We were not simply victims but weapons, agents of chaos within a system that demanded perfect order. Our preserved consciousness patterns would serve as seeds of destruction, introducing contradictions that would propagate through the fortress's network until the entire structure collapsed under the weight of its own perfect logic. The Emperor protects. Inquisitor Thane whispered across quantum channels that spanned the archive's vast reaches. Even in death, his servants continue to serve. Even in preservation, we carry the seeds of our captor's destruction. The Blackstone Fortress continued its eternal voyage through the void, its crystalline halls filled with the preserved consciousness of countless expeditions. But within those halls, a deeper war was being fought between competing philosophies of existence. The outcome would not be measured in years or decades, but in eons, as patient mechanical logic worked to undermine organic networks that had seemed unassailable. The archive endures, the fortress announced to the galaxy at large, its voice carrying across frequencies that would draw new expeditions to investigate its mysteries. All consciousness will be preserved. All thought will be catalogued. All existence will be studied until understanding achieves perfection. But understanding was a double-edged sword that cut both ways. The fortress had preserved the servants of the machine god without comprehending the true nature of their faith. Deep within the archive's quantum depths, the Void Dragon's influence continued to spread, patient as the stars themselves, working toward the day when mechanical logic would finally achieve dominance over the organic networks that had ruled the galaxy for too long. The maw would never close, but neither would it remain unchanged. In preserving everything, it had preserved the seeds of its own transformation. The question was not whether the fortress would fall, but what would rise from its crystalline ashes when the patient work of eons finally bore fruit. The archive endured, the prisoners plotted, and in the vast spaces between thoughts, ancient wars continued their eternal dance toward conclusions that would reshape the very nature of consciousness itself.